David Johnson's peaceful life was shattered the night an intruder wearing a bat-shaped mask broke into his home. The mysterious figure, who left behind nothing but a chilling note, quickly became an obsession for Detective Elise Carrington. As David and his family struggled to make sense of the terror they'd endured, Carrington delved deeper into a case that seemed to grow darker by the minute. Who was the man behind the mask? And why had he chosen the Johnsons as his targets? The hunt for the Batman intruder was on, but the deeper Carrington dug, the more she realized that this was no ordinary criminal. This was a game, and the stakes were higher than anyone had imagined. The night was eerily calm, with the quiet hum of suburban life stretching across the peaceful neighborhood. The houses were nestled behind large trees, their windows glowing faintly from the lights inside. It was the kind of neighborhood where children played outside until dusk, and families took evening walks together after dinner. It was a place that felt safe, where the sound of footsteps on the pavement was as familiar as the chirp of crickets in the grass. For the Johnson family, the night seemed like any other, a typical Tuesday evening. Inside their home, the family of four were winding down. David, the father, was in the living room, flipping through the channels of the television, absent-mindedly looking for something to watch. His wife, Claire, was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Their two children, Ethan and Lily, were in the back room, playing quietly before bedtime. The house was filled with the soft, soothing sounds of family life, light laughter, the clink of dishes, and the distant murmur of the television. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time. But as the night grew darker, something began to change, something that no one could quite put their finger on. There was an unsettling quiet in the air, as if the world outside was holding its breath. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves outside their windows. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting strange shadows on the sidewalks. Everything seemed to be in a state of anticipation, as though something unknown was creeping closer. But the Johnsons, lost in the rhythm of their evening, paid little attention to the subtle shift in atmosphere. In the shadows of the trees lining the street, a figure watched from a distance. He stood still, cloaked in darkness, blending perfectly with the night. The figure wore a black costume, his face hidden behind a mask shaped like a bat. He was tall and lean, with a purposeful air to his movements. The Batman intruder had been preparing for this moment for weeks, carefully observing the Johnson family's routine, learning the patterns of their lives. Every detail mattered. He had studied them from afar, knowing when they would be at home, when they would leave, and when they would be vulnerable. He knew exactly when to strike. With each passing night, the figure grew bolder. He had scoped out the house several times, taking careful note of the security system, the layout of the property, and the timing of the family's activities. It had become an obsession for him, a twisted game of cat and mouse, where the stakes were life and death. His desire wasn't just to steal, though that was part of it. What drove him was the need to instill fear, to watch as his victims trembled in the wake of his presence. He wanted to be feared, to leave behind a mark that no one would ever forget. And tonight, his opportunity had finally arrived. As the Johnsons continued with their routine, completely unaware of the danger approaching, the figure slowly made his way toward the house. He moved silently, like a shadow in the night, careful not to make a sound. His steps were calculated, deliberate, as if he had done this countless times before. He reached the side of the house, where a small window, left slightly ajar, offered the perfect entry point. With a practiced motion, the intruder slid the window open and crawled through, slipping into the darkened house unnoticed. Inside, the silence was almost deafening. The lights were dim, the only sound the quiet rustle of the curtains as the wind gently blew through the open window. The intruder paused for a moment, listening. He could hear the faint hum of the television in the other room, the soft clatter, of dishes in the kitchen, and the distant footsteps of children playing upstairs. Everything seemed normal, yet deep down, he knew this was the calm before the storm. He was inside now, and there was no turning back. With a steady breath, the figure moved through the house, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. He knew the layout of the home, knew exactly where to go. He was in control. No one could stop him now. The family was about to be thrust into a nightmare they never saw coming. What they didn't know was that their sense of security had been shattered the moment the masked intruder had crossed the threshold of their home. Tonight, their lives would change forever. The next morning, the Johnson family woke to an unsettling silence. It wasn't the usual sounds of birds chirping or the faint hum of passing cars that greeted them. The house felt different, almost too quiet. David was the first to notice. He was the one who usually woke up early to brew his coffee and check the weather. But that morning, there was an unusual stillness. He stepped out of bed, stretching his arms as the soft light of the early morning filtered through the blinds. He glanced toward the window, noticing that the outside world seemed just as peaceful as ever. Yet something felt off. He rubbed his eyes and dismissed the feeling, attributing it to a restless night of sleep. Claire, still in the kitchen, noticed it too. The morning routine was always a comfortable, familiar affair. But today, it felt like there was a slight tension in the air, something she couldn't put her finger on. She turned on the coffee maker, but as she waited for the familiar sound of the brew, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until she flicked the light switch to the kitchen that the oddity became undeniable. The lights flickered before going out entirely. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure if she was imagining it, but the darkened kitchen confirmed her suspicion. The electricity had gone out. It wasn't uncommon for the power to flicker in their neighborhood, especially during storms, but it was a clear and unexpected shift. She immediately grabbed her phone to check if there had been any local outages or weather-related warnings. Nothing. The house was completely still, save for the low hum of the refrigerator in the background, now running on backup power. David, hearing the silence, walked to the kitchen to check on Claire. He, too, immediately noticed the absence of light. "Another power surge?" he asked, but Claire only shrugged, perplexed. The children, Ethan and Lily, had just woken up in their rooms. As they stumbled down the hall to the kitchen, Claire gestured toward the darkened windows and sighed. "It's strange, isn't it?" They went about their morning routine, though with an air of uncertainty. David attempted to find a flashlight but couldn't locate one in the usual spots. The feeling of unease lingered, hanging in the air like a thick fog. The house, which had always been so familiar and comforting, now felt a bit foreign in the most uncomfortable way. The family huddled together in the living room, their only source of light now coming from the soft glow of their phone screens. Claire suggested calling the electric company, but before she could dial, a sudden noise jolted everyone from their stillness. The sound came from the front of the house, an unmistakable creaking noise, as if someone was opening a door or moving around outside. David immediately stood, concern on his face. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice steady but the apprehension in his eyes clear. He walked toward the front door, the only exit that hadn't been thoroughly examined. But as he neared the door, he froze. Something didn't feel right. He slowly turned the handle, expecting to find the source of the strange noise. A branch brushing against the door, perhaps a stray animal. But the door opened far too easily. The latch wasn't caught. Someone had already opened it. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped back, surveying the area around him for any sign of intrusion. The air around him felt colder than it should have been, a bone-chilling cold that cut through the stillness of the morning. Meanwhile, Claire and the children moved to the back of the house, instinctively searching for signs of anything amiss. They checked the windows and doors, but nothing seemed disturbed. Everything appeared perfectly normal, Yet David's unease was growing by the second. The front door hadn't been left open by accident. Someone had intentionally opened it. David's mind raced as he hurried back to the living room, where Claire and the children were now huddled together, their faces etched with confusion and worry. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice low but steady. The words sent a chill down Claire's spine. She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. And then, as the morning sunlight began to pour into the room through the now unguarded windows, they saw it. Something on the dining table, a piece of paper, folded neatly in half. Claire moved toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. As she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. The note was simple, short, but the message was clear. "The bat has flown free. You won't see me again." David felt his blood run cold as Claire read the words aloud. His heart raced as the weight of the message sank in. The intruder had been here, and now they were left in a state of terror, unsure of where he had gone or what he wanted. Was he still nearby? The morning that had begun with confusion and a creeping sense of dread soon turned into a nightmare of its own. The Johnsons stood in their living room, staring at the cryptic note on the table, their minds struggling to make sense of what had just transpired. The police were already on their way, but David couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that gripped him. What had this person meant by the note? And how had he gotten in without leaving a trace? The front door had been ajar, but there were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows, nothing to suggest a struggle. David's thoughts raced as he glanced at his family, his wife Claire, and their children, Ethan and Lily, standing by in shocked silence. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from confusion to raw fear. They had never felt this vulnerable before. The house, once a sanctuary, now seemed like a trap, a place where they were no longer safe. Claire stood, holding the note in her trembling hands, trying to read the few words over and over again, as if by doing so she could make them mean something else, but the words were chilling. "The bat has flown free. You won't see me again." She couldn't comprehend it. It felt like something out of a horror movie, not the reality of her life. As the minutes ticked by, the sound of sirens wailed. In the distance, growing louder as they approached. The police arrived within moments, and soon the house was swarming with officers, each of them doing their best to calm the family and gather evidence. But there was little to find. No fingerprints. On the note, no sign of who had entered or left. It was as though the intruder had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only an unsettling message. Detective Elise Carrington was one of the first to arrive at the scene. A veteran of the police force, she had seen more than her fair share of break-ins and burglaries, but this case felt different. There was something off about it, something deeply unsettling. She had worked many cases over the years, but the note left behind felt personal, almost like a taunt. This wasn't a random crime. It was calculated, deliberate, and Carrington wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She immediately went to work, surveying the scene with a meticulous eye. Her mind raced as she analyzed the layout of the house, the possible points of entry, and the clues that were left behind. She questioned David and Claire separately, but both were too rattled to provide any solid information. They could only recount what had happened the night before, the sudden power outage, the strange noises, and the realization that they weren't alone. But nothing about the intruder's identity or motive made sense. As Carrington examined the house, she noticed something curious. The intruder had left no obvious signs of theft. There was no missing jewelry, no valuable electronics taken. Everything of value appeared to be untouched. The only thing that had been disturbed was the note, placed carefully on the dining table, like a piece of art. It made no sense. Why would someone break into a house, scare the family half to death, and leave behind a cryptic message without taking anything? This wasn't just a break-in, it was a statement, But what was the statement? And why target the Johnson family? Carrington took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing as she continued to inspect the home. There was a sense of urgency growing within her. Whoever had done this wasn't going to stop here. They had made their move, and Carrington knew that the next step was crucial. The note, cryptic as it was, had to be a clue. But what did it mean? And who was the Batman the intruder referred to? Was it just a nickname, or did it point to something more significant? As the police began to collect evidence and secure the area, Carrington turned to speak with the Johnsons again. They were still shaken, and she could see the fear in their eyes. But she also saw something else, a sense of determination. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand who had invaded their home and why. And that, Carrington thought, was the first step toward catching the person responsible. She assured the family that they would do everything they could to find the person who had terrorized them. But even as she spoke the words, a troubling thought crossed her mind. She knew this wasn't going to be an easy case. Whoever the intruder was, they were playing a dangerous game. And Carrington had a feeling that this was just the beginning. Outside, the police had begun to canvass the neighborhood, questioning neighbors and looking for any clues that could lead them to the intruder. But no one had seen anything unusual the night before. The streets had been as quiet as usual, the neighborhood peaceful and undisturbed. The power outage, it seemed, had been the only odd occurrence. Hours passed, and still, no answers. Carrington spent the rest of the day at the Johnsons' home, piecing together the fragments of information she had. But nothing concrete emerged. The intruder had vanished as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind only the haunting message on the table. As the sun began to set, Carrington knew one thing for certain. This case was far from over. The Batman intruder was still out there, and the Johnsons' nightmare was far from finished. The hunt had only just begun. The days that followed the break-in were a blur of police activity, neighborhood searches, and mounting fear. The Johnsons, once able to go about their day-to-day lives with a sense of security, now found themselves trapped in their own home, unable to escape the constant unease. David tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but he could see the anxiety in his wife Claire's eyes, in the way she hesitated at every creak of the floorboards, every knock on the door. Even Ethan and Lily, usually carefree and playful, had become more withdrawn, their innocent laughter now replaced by nervous glances toward the windows and doors. Detective Carrington, too, was consumed by the case. She had worked tirelessly to gather evidence, interviewing neighbors, collecting footage from nearby security cameras, and tracking down any lead that might help her understand the intruder's identity. But each attempt only seemed to lead her deeper into a maze of confusion. The case, which had seemed simple enough at first, was quickly becoming a riddle with no clear answers. The Batman intruder was elusive. Despite the hours of surveillance and the detailed investigation, there was no clear suspect. No one had seen anything unusual. The neighborhood was tight-knit, and most residents kept to themselves, but they had all agreed that the silence surrounding the break-in was unnerving. The intruder had been quick, efficient, and eerily calm. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious evidence that anyone had been caught off guard. It was as if the person knew exactly what they were doing and knew exactly when and where to strike. Then, one evening, nearly a week after the break-in, Carrington received an anonymous tip. It was vague, but it offered a glimmer of hope. The tipster claimed to have seen someone matching the description of the Batman intruder near an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The tip seemed like a long shot, but Carrington knew that in a case like this, any lead, no matter how small, was worth investigating. She rallied her team, and they set off toward the warehouse, a place that had long been a haven for vagrants and criminals. It was a desolate, run-down area, with broken windows, overgrown weeds, and rusting metal scattered across the lot. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the broken structures. Carrington felt a sense of foreboding as they approached the warehouse, knowing that they might finally be getting closer to the person responsible for terrorizing the Johnson family. As they entered the building, the officers moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The warehouse was vast, filled with rows of old crates and stacks of forgotten materials. It was the perfect place for someone to hide, to disappear into the shadows. Carrington signaled for her team to spread out, each officer taking a different section of the warehouse to search. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The only sounds were the soft shuffle of boots on the concrete floor and the occasional creak of metal. Carrington's heart pounded in her chest, the tension mounting with every step. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The warehouse seemed alive with the presence of someone, lurking just out of sight. And then, as Carrington reached the farthest corner of the building, she saw it. A door, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates, stood slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within. Her instincts kicked in. She motioned for her team to follow her as she approached the door, her breath shallow in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Inside the room was a collection of strange items. There were photographs of the Johnson family, photos that had clearly been taken without their knowledge. The walls were covered with maps and diagrams, all detailing the layout of the Johnsons' home. And in the center of the room, there was a large table covered with notes, some scribbled hastily, others carefully written, as if documenting every move the family had made in the days leading up to the break-in. Carrington's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. The intruder hadn't just been targeting the Johnsons for their valuables. He had been watching them, studying them. This was more than just a robbery. This was a game to him, a twisted, obsessive pursuit. And then, Carrington saw something that made her stomach twist. Among the clutter of photographs and notes, she found a picture of a man standing in. Days passed, and the investigation into the Batman intruder seemed to grow colder with each passing hour. Detective Carrington was feeling the pressure, the weight of the case heavy on her shoulders. The photographs found in the abandoned warehouse provided some clues, but they led to more questions than answers. She couldn't shake the thought that they were missing something crucial. The Johnsons, still shaken and fearful, were growing desperate for answers. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock on the door, seemed to bring them closer to the edge of madness. Their home no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a target. Carrington worked tirelessly, digging deeper into the case, following every lead, no matter how insignificant it seemed. But as the days turned into weeks, the trail grew colder. The Batman intruder was still out there, moving in the shadows, always one step ahead of them. The note left behind at the Johnsons' home had seemed like a taunt, a message that the intruder was in control, but it also felt like a challenge. The words, "You won't see me again," lingered in Carrington's mind, as if they were mocking her, daring her to find him. It wasn't until a breakthrough came in the most unexpected of places, a small, local pawn shop, where Carrington began to piece together the final parts of the puzzle. The pawn shop was a place frequented by the kind of people who didn't ask too many questions. On a hunch, Carrington had decided to check the records, hoping to find some connection between the intruder and the Johnsons' belongings. What she discovered sent a shockwave through her. Among the items in the shop, there was a receipt for a rare, vintage bat-shaped mask, the kind only an obsessive collector would seek. The mask was expensive, and the receipt had been signed with a name Carrington recognized, Gregory Morrow. The name rang a bell. It was connected to an old, unsolved case from years ago. Morrow had been a criminal, a small-time thief with a history of petty crimes, but his reputation had been overshadowed by his obsession with Batman, a fascination that bordered on the unhealthy. He had disappeared from the public eye after his last crime, and authorities had assumed he had gone underground. Now, it seemed he had resurfaced, and Carrington realized that Gregory Morrow was the man behind the mask. Her heart raced as she processed the information. Morrow had been obsessed with the idea of being a vigilante, of becoming someone larger than life. He had never been able to shake the delusion that he could step into the role of the mysterious caped crusader. But now, his delusion had turned into something much darker. Morrow was no longer just fantasizing about the role, he was acting on it. He had become the very villain he once admired, and his obsession had turned dangerous. He had targeted the Johnson family, not for their wealth, but because they represented something to him. A challenge, a game to be played. With this new information, Carrington intensified her search for Gregory Morrow. She pulled every file from his past, retraced his steps, and interviewed everyone who might have known him. What she uncovered was even more disturbing. Morrow had been living off the grid for years, moving from one small town to the next, never staying in one place for too long. He was elusive, a master at blending into the background, always one step ahead of those who were trying to find him. But Carrington wasn't going to give up. She knew that Morrow's obsession with the Johnsons wasn't just a random act. It was personal. He had been studying them, following them for weeks. His planning was meticulous, and he had a clear goal in mind. But what was it? Was he planning something bigger? Something that would complete his twisted vision of himself as a Batman figure? Carrington's breakthrough came when she found a connection between Morrow and a nearby city, an old apartment building where he had stayed briefly under an alias. The building had been abandoned for years, but Carrington had a gut feeling that this was where she would find him. Armed with this new lead, she rallied her team and headed to the building, knowing that they were closer than ever to catching him. The building was in disrepair, a decaying shell of its former self. The floors creaked beneath their feet as they made their way through the darkened hallways, their flashlights illuminating the dust and debris that covered the floor. The air smelled musty, stale, and the atmosphere felt oppressive. Carrington's nerves were on edge, her every sense alert. She could feel it in her bones. They were close. They were getting closer to the end of this twisted game. They reached the top floor, the last place Morrow had been known to stay. The door to his old apartment was locked, but a quick search revealed that it had been forced open recently. Carrington's heart pounded as she motioned for the officers to surround the apartment. They were moments away from confronting the man who had terrorized the Johnson family, who had lived in the shadows for so long. With one final glance at her team, Carrington kicked down the door. The apartment was dark, eerily still, but there was a flickering light from a small desk in the corner. As they moved closer, they saw him, Gregory Morrow, sitting motionless, his face hidden behind the same bat-shaped mask he had worn during the break-in. He didn't move, didn't even flinch. He sat there, as if waiting for them. Carrington's pulse quickened. They had finally found him. But the question remained, what would happen now that the game was over? Would he surrender, or would this twisted obsession end in violence? There was no telling what was going through Morrow's mind, but one thing was certain. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The end of a long, terrifying chase.